All right. Well, hello again, everyone. Matthew Janisek with my friend.
Hi, I'm Bob.
That's Bob. And we're here to engage in another conversation about ideas. And they're ideas that Bob and I have been talking about over our last several episodes, if you want to call them that. And I'm going to let Bob do a quick recap on those, and then we're going to get into the next installment of the development of, I guess, progress and process. So go for it.
Yeah. I think what sort of has brought us together is we have a, shall I say, common interest in trying to better understand the process of social change, which is really what we're talking about. And in our conversations have really been focused really on what the writings of the Baha'i faith have had to say about how these processes work both individually and collectively in society. So in terms of where we are, I think we started with the idea of an individual's growth starts with being able to discern what is true from what is false, beginning with what is true about their own identity as a human being. And then from there, the question is once you have that clear and firm sense of what is true from what is false, beginning with your identity, then you could go out, and then the next step is how do we, shall we say, have effect in society? And that is essentially, it's all effect we have in society, and all effect that society has in us is in relationship. And so learning how to hold meaningful and uplifting conversations that help to elevate our individual consciousness is really the beginning of our individual process of contributing to change in society.
Right, and since a lot of what's motivated Bob and I to come together is the as both social studies teachers and veteran social studies teachers, we see and have experienced the angst in young people, the desire to know more, but the stress of not being able to tell what is true and what is not true. And even adults today, we know, have a very difficult time. Just look at our political process. So this isn't at all easy, what the things that we're talking about putting together. But what we're trying to do is have individuals take a chance at peeling back the layers of the onion to figure this stuff out.
Right.
And first we have to reestablish a base before we can progress as a civilization. But everybody knows one thing. They know that they don't know right now. And yet I would look at, Bob, some of the conversations we've had, and there are elements where you and I can discern truth from fiction.
Oh, for sure.
And I think a lot of people think that in and of itself may resonate in arrogance at times. But it's the only place that we end up getting with some of the biggest questions is a place of humility, which is actually the greatest place for learning to take root. Real learning is to realize and be admitful of all the things that we don't know. So that's I don't know. I'm just throwing that in there.
Oh yeah, I think that on the one hand, there certainly are things we can know and know for sure, but at the same time, there are certainly things which we don't know or we're unsure about. And I think it's important for conversation to include both.
All right. So the first part was individual growth.
Right. The second part was really relationship, because that's when we begin to, shall we say, have an influence on the process of social change in society. But the third step, which we talked about, in our last time we got together, was more about, okay, well, those conversations need to lead to action. And on an individual level, we're all capable of action. And we talked a little bit about what kinds of actions are the kinds of actions which actually can contribute, shall I say, to the betterment of society as well. Today, my sense is we're going to take all of what we've learned about our own individual involvement in society and place it more within the collective process of social change. Like talking about the process of social transformation from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
Understand the larger processes that we're a part of. Because I think in many ways that affects not just our knowledge of social change, but knowing our place within it, I think helps us to set a realistic expectation for how much we can contribute as an individual.
And you get the sense that naturally a lot of people, just by looking at social media, if we want, we know a lot of young people do, and adults do too, but people want to be part of the process inherently. They want to belong. People want to feel belonging. And even though it's such a rudimentary and maybe not the best way to express your thoughts is via social media, the conversations that we love to engage in are the conversations that explore this depth and then reveal these obstacles and the historic. I'm excited for today because the historic roots of transformational change that we both agree have happened throughout history, that's what's led us to some understanding. Those has probably what's led us to even greater truths and greater conclusions about how this can be learned from and not always repeated.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think like Matt, I'm also very excited about the prospects for social change. I know a lot of people are sort of wondering whether or not, in their present circumstances, is this something that's even possible? But my sense is that on a spiritual level, is that there's been a tremendous amount of progress that has happened to get us to this point. And I think we're in we're in a stage of history where there are certain spiritual forces that have been released into society that are really advancing the process, shall we say, at a pace and on a scale that really is unprecedented. I mean, I've never seen processes of social change moving so quickly. And more than that is that the processes of social change that are happening on a worldwide basis. And this, I think, is really unprecedented in history. And one of the things I'll say is, like, for instance, when I think in terms of spiritual forces, it might be easier for people to understand that as energy. And for me, all I could say is that my observation is there is this incredible energy that has been released within society. And to me, that energy, it can be used, obviously, for negative or destructive purposes, but it also can be used for positive and creative purposes as well. My sense is the fact the energy is there gives us a potential to move in more and more positive and creative directions as we try to bring humanity together as one people in one world.
Yeah. To throw like an American perspective on this is that seeing as the American citizenry is, generally speaking, compared to the rest of the world, in a pretty decent economic state, even though many of us feel the deterioration of these systems that are approaching, generally speaking, we are satisfied with life, in a way, and that the change that is maybe happening quicker in other parts of the world, a culture of change and discussion of that change, in the United States, we are often presented with a reality by mainstream culture that isn't anywhere near what's happening, and more so now than ever before. So I think you've talked of the revelation before. We are having many things revealed to us, and one of the things that is being revealed to Americans and people of the world, like you said, is the system that has exercised authority and power over this earth over the last 100 to 200 years has been a global force. Yeah. So what we are seeing is the awakening on a global scale of maybe the weakening of the global force. And so what people are often feeling is a negative energy throughout civilization is the stripping away of the things that may be bad and that people are becoming more aware of, So looking at the development of what we're going through, confusion, not knowing how to discern from what is true and untrue, is simply part of this maturation process of humanity. And it's actually a good thing that people are now beginning to have these conversations and begin to realize that if we're going to build something transformative in civilization, some things have to break down first, and that's okay.
Yeah, yeah. I honestly think that the easiest way to understand society is to understand society as simply a collection of individuals. And if you look like individually, like when I look individually at my own life, where has the growth or the maturation sort of originated from? Is I would say that typically is, for instance, it really are the tests and the trials and the difficulties, shall we say, the sufferings that I've had to endure, and we all have in some way, shape, or form, that really are the sources of our own maturity and our own growth. It's those people who live completely a life of comfort and pleasure. They're the ones who never have to, the ones who don't have to face adversity and therefore overcome adversity. They're the ones who, shall we say, remain as children their whole lives.
Yeah.
They're the ones who really never grow up. And I think it's important to know that it's that suffering. Now, when I think about today, is the kind of suffering that characterizes individual life in a modern world is, to me, we live in a world where we've assigned material reality and exclusivity. Like everything is a material reality. We've completely ignored the possibility that there is reality beyond material reality. And as a result, I think that this has caused a tremendous amount of suffering. I think of it as like a spiritual emptiness or a spiritual void, where we know we are spiritual beings that happen to be living in a material world, but the world itself doesn't allow for that reality to be part of our lives.
No, it actually undermines it.
Right. And so I think what's happening is that as people, shall we say, have to deal with that, is that more and more people are opening up to the reality that they are more than just a material being. They are more than their body. They are more than, than what they can do physically or how they look physically. That's not really who they are.
Yeah.
And I think people are more and more drawn, shall we say, into learnings which are more and more spiritual in nature. Now, on a collective level, I think the same thing is happening. On a collective level, we have a society where essentially the goal is to accumulate material wealth. That's what determines our success in society. And we are all individuals who are competing with each other for limited material resources. And so it's me against you all the time in this unending competition. Well, the effect of this on a collective level is also the same. And what's happening essentially is that because collectively we're organized within a reality that doesn't match what is true,
Right.
is people are beginning, shall we say, to open up to the possibility, the active search for the truth of who we are as a humanity. And I think that's really what's going on on this level, but it's based upon the idea that adversity, trials, tests, difficulties, they all serve a purpose in our lives, and it's not necessarily to give us what we want, but it's what we need, because what we need to do is mature individually, and humanity as a whole also needs to mature if we're going to live in societies that are functional.
Right, and I think you put up, or we spoke of earlier, the things that are getting in the way of that. And one of the big elements that I've asked you in private before, but if we're talking about a spiritual foundation for reality in a Western culture that has, I would probably argue since Darwin, has steadily attempted to undermine spiritual education or the exploration of spiritual ideas as an impediment to progress, where we're trying to look at this through the perspective of spirituality as the starting point, as a foundation, since civilization had organized itself in many cultures of the world with moral principles that are generally derived from spiritual faith. And then unless people want to do it this way, right? And that's what we talked. Unless people have enjoyed the process of change, which has generally only come through economic misery or warfare.
It's true. When I look at the long stretch of history, is I think that the advances in history, the major advances of humanity in its maturity throughout history, have come on the heels of some revelation. So, for example, is the revelation in the Old Testament, is that really those principles, those moral and ethical guidelines that were revealed at that time through, say, Moses, became the foundations for the building of what was civilization itself. But more than that is like you look at shall we say, the time of Jesus, is following the time of Jesus, and is that there was this incredible spiritual energy that was released into civilization, and I think it accounted for the kind of progress which would end up creating, shall we say, Europe and Western civilization in a really important way, And when you look at Muhammad, just to give you one more brief example, is when Muhammad was on the scene in the Middle East, his Bedouin tribes had been fighting for about 100 years, and shall we say, the Arab world was descending into chaos. But what would happen is that shortly after the revelation of Muhammad, is essentially the Islamic world would create a civilization that literally was unmatched in history. It's those kinds of things which really are pushing civilization forward. And so the foundation for our ability to cooperate at higher and higher levels of complexity depend upon essentially a common unity around spiritual principles that apply at a certain point in time in history. And so I know that's not how history is taught in the public schools today.
Of course not. Right.
But I have to say is that my own observation is that it is the spiritual foundation which actually allows for humanity to advance.
Yeah, I'm trying to process it all at the same time and think of the obstacles to making this a little bit more realistic. And historically, this is what I was going to say, right? That from the Old Testament and your 10 Commandments, even though that revelation has been explained to people, for example, and my favorite one to always hit is thou shalt not bear false witness. Because we all know today that part of the reason we cannot discern true from untrue is the world is filled with liars. Yes. And oftentimes those liars, Machiavelli would say, are going to make their way into power because they're willing to lie, cheat, and steal to get there. So knowing that is like a thing that came out of Western Civ that is really, I think, a revelation in and of itself. That humanity needs to realize that if they need to take a close look at people in power and how did they accumulate or gain that position.
Right.
And what they realize is they often did not do things ethically. And which is why when many of the religious leaders that we study talk about and use in this process of progress in humanity is one where they become the protagonists that we spoke of earlier.
Yes.
They want to right what is clearly wrong. And all the faiths of the world have experienced this, at least in their narratives. And can we profit by their experiences and their wisdom? That's what we should be in discussion of. Not whose idea is better, but part of the process of spiritual growth as a collective is the one that will teach what I think most people would agree with. A God major premise is unity.
Yeah, I think that gets us, in many ways, that sort of gets us to the present stage in historical transformation. I mean, to me, there are two forces that exist that, shall we say, drive the process of historical change. One force is the force of disintegration.
Yeah.
And disintegration happens when society and individuals who live within it, shall we say, fall out of touch with those spiritual principles which are at the foundation of, shall we say, human progress. So, for instance, when you talk about the commandment against bearing false witness, is when people begin to ignore what is true or pursue what is in their best interest individually and materially at the expense of what is true, is then that accounts for the disintegration of society. And we're living in a world today that embraces power over truth.
Nice.
So as a result, we see the social order around the world disintegrating.
Yeah.
That's how it is. And that's one force of change. But there are other forces of change. So, for example, when we speak, we talk about regaining that sense of living within those spiritual truths. Like society should be organized around principles that are true as opposed to principles that give certain individuals power over others. Right. And that's the other, shall we say, end of the other aspect of historical change. These are people who want to pull people together and unify them so they're actually acting within what is true. And I think both of these forces have a place in the processes of historical transformation. They're not necessarily two forces that are butting up against each other.
And they're often happening simultaneously.
I think they are.
They are.
And I think that's normal. It's an interesting idea. I think in our age is that we're living, the number one problem that needs to be addressed is the problem of conflict and division. There is so much conflict and division at every level of society, whether it's on the individual level or on the collective human level around the world, that it's very difficult for there to be any real progress.
Yeah.
That's it. But the solution, therefore, is unity, is the unification of all of humanity, which really is, shall we say, the mission of the Baha'i faith. And it's a very explicit mission of that faith, but it's essentially the idea is you unify all thought around what is true, and the highest truths are those which have been revealed for us in this day and age, essentially by a manifestation of God. And that is the unifying force for humanity throughout the world today. But I think one of the things I've learned from examining those writings myself is that the processes of disintegration and the processes of integration are really part of one process. They're not two things butting up against each other. Right. You know what I'm saying? And this, to me, itself is sort of like a different way of thinking. I think we've been taught to, shall we say, to think of change happens, shall we say, in open, violent conflict between two opposing forces.
Yes.
Think of either good versus evil. It's that kind of a process. And it's that idea that we have unity, but only unity in our common interest against a common enemy.
Against someone else's common interest.
Right.
So,
and, it's so interesting. And it's very... Honestly, I think these ideas really stem from Marx in the 19th century. I think they become embedded in all of society. It's not a communist idea; it's a Western idea. Is that Marx essentially said that all change happens during conflict that must end inevitably in a violent revolution. So people are constantly fighting against each other in, shall we say, this open conflict in the name of social change. And to me, this paradigm which exists, which is, I think, what we've been taught in our societies, is really, shall we say, it's the kind of thing that's getting in the way of progress. To me, like you said, Matt, is disintegration and integration are two processes that are happening simultaneously, but they're not two processes that need to come into direct conflict with each other at all.
No, I'm just thinking of the manifestation of when the absence of spirit, like you have said, allows evil deeds to transpire in this world. That there are manifestations, and how do we respond as a collective to, if we consider something that we know and we believe to be true that is happening in this world is human trafficking of any kind.
Sure.
We know it's true. We know it's happening, and there needs to be a sense of justice in that. And
Yes.
and that isn't. It's naturally going to create an us versus them mental state, because I'm never going to traffic in children, right? So, how do we respond as a collective to the manifestation of these evils, which do show up in the absence of spirit?
Right. Well, that's a good question. And my sense is the way it's envisioned through the Baha'i faith is that the response is on two levels. On a long-term level is to the extent we can restore a genuine spiritual foundation to education, is more people will develop, will take the qualities, the spiritual qualities that they have within them, and actually develop them through their life. So, for instance, if someone is raised actively cultivating their capacity for love, beginning with their love and knowledge of God, which is a spiritual idea, is then they would be much less likely as they get older to even consider thinking about trafficking in children.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense to them. Just like it's just that simple. If you have a moral and ethical grounding, the chance that you're going to spend your life actively exploiting children is less and less likely. But having said that, there still could be situations where there are people who've never cultivated their whatever capacity they have to think of others. And to me, that's where the institutions of the society have to be there to administer justice, because there has to be a sense of safety and order in society. And so that's what institutions in society are for, to administer that justice. It's not for me as an individual to judge another person. I want to support another person. I want to love another person. I want to be an example. I want to be merciful to another person. But the institutions in society exist as a way to provide justice and order and safety so that there could be progress.
And this is what we are living through is a manifestation where everybody in the world, if you asked, do you support trafficking of human beings, they will say no.
Right.
But yet at the same time, they hold the reality in their head that most of the nation's institutions of power today, they may not be engaged in it, but they sure as heck condone it by their inaction.
I mean,
so there's that part of disintegration.
I do think that's part of the disintegration, but I think that disintegration goes much further than the explicit trafficking in children. My attitude is that those people who hold power today are holding power is what they really are doing. And to me, this is the ultimate disintegration, is they've literally think of other people as commodities to be used for their own material gain.
Yeah.
And so as horrible as trafficking in children is, I think that any form of exploitation of another human being is due to a lack of spiritual grounding.
Okay.
Itself. And I think this is happening when, for instance, corporations around the world are building factories in forests in Indonesia, and then paying people to make T-shirts or gym shoes, you know what I'm saying, 2 cents a day. That is a form of human exploitation where essentially we're turning people essentially into commodities themselves, where we're nothing but material used to produce more material. And this itself is the disintegration.
Yeah.
I think that the trafficking in children is just an extreme example of the injustice associated with a process that is completely accepted within the established order today. But I honestly have to say is that I think as more and more people come to realize this, and I think people do understand this, if maybe not, they're not talking about it, they intuitively get it, is I think what this does is it serves a function, just like suffering in our individual life serves a function, is that it serves a function, and the function is sweeping away, shall we say, barriers that would keep people within the present order. I see more and more people are detaching from the present order, and they have very little reason to, shall we say, hope that that order can be reformed. And for me, that's the purpose of disintegration. Once it gets to a certain point, is people now wonder, if young parents talk to me and they wonder, like, should I even send my kids to the public schools? Or is there an alternative system that exists outside of the public schools so that my child can actually receive an education?
And that goes to one of my big questions, is that, and I started out with that today, in a world where spiritual truth or the pursuit of it is denied by the institution for just the appearance that you might be pushing any sort of a spiritual program. We have many self-righteous young people at times who already know the truth that there is no God, and they're more than willing to tell you. And if you suggest anything otherwise, or an alternative viewpoint should be studied, it's just not allowed in the current paradigm. So the exploration of any potential spiritual truisms aren't even allowed to be engaged in anymore. So that would be one of the reasons I think that we have a large task with that dynamic and that growing number of people who are irreligious in our culture and civilization, who do not submit to a godlike authority figure.
It's true.
So how do you make a concept that starts with a spiritual foundation applicable in a civilization where arguably close to 50% of its population won't even actively admit that spiritualism exists?
Well, I think that in many cases is the people in power are doing it already. I mean, as the disintegration becomes more rapid and more extreme, I think more and more people, like on an individual basis, come to realize that they're just being treated by their employer or by their friends, essentially as commodities or instruments for someone else's, shall we say, material gain. And they realize this, and I think the initial reaction to that is, once you've sort of realized, you see that reality, is to pull back and say, wait a minute, am I just a commodity? Well, to me, that's the beginning of opening up to the idea that you're more than just something material. Like, who I am depends on my character as a human being. That kind of thing. And to me, that is essentially the beginning of being open to the idea that you are more than just a material being, but there is a spiritual component to who I am and what my identity is. And so for me, I think a lot of the difficulty that exists today is going to work itself out over time, because the forces of disintegration are going to open more and more people to the possibility that they are spiritual beings and they need to actively cultivate their own spiritual growth. Having said that, I think that those people like the two of us who already openly embrace, shall we say, spiritual reality, is we have a responsibility to raise our capacity to be in relationship with all kinds of people. To meet them where they are with this idea. So, for example, I've talked to a lot of people who essentially sort of, shall we say, they don't feel comfortable entirely with, shall we say, openly speaking about God. And my attitude is, well, you could talk about spirituality in so many ways without really using the G word. It's okay. There's no problem. So for me, when I think about God, I think of God as truth, God as reality, like what's been revealed by God through his messengers over time are realities which essentially are beyond the reach of human beings, to acquire for themselves. Otherwise, there's no reason for this to have been revealed. If we were capable of doing this, so it's that idea. But what's being revealed are spiritual truths. And those truths, which are spiritual in nature, are the highest possible truths that are available to humanity.
And this isn't new. If you study history,
Not at all.
Let's go back to some of the earliest stuff, even though I think even our ancient history will ultimately have to be rewritten. But if we want to start at the Egyptians in a way, that was part of their actual curriculum and learning process, is eventually learning of the spirit. And that was the highest phase of their development, earthly, heavenly,
Right.
and then spiritual.
Because it's purely conceptual.
Yes.
And that's the highest stage of human intelligence. And I think
Wait,
that,
who's that? Who's the Greek? Weak minds talk about people, and great minds talk about ideas. And
I want to say it was
forget it.
Aristotle,
Yeah,
but I
so.
could be wrong, But I think those are people who are just philosophers.
Yeah.
So simply the use of our intellect to find the truth is itself an exercise of a spiritual quality. Is we were given the capacity for a reason. You see what I'm saying? It's inborn within us, but yet it's not something that's material. It's not something we can grab, and it's not something that can be taken away from us. It's a spiritual quality. So our capacity for reason and science itself is a spiritual quality. And we have a responsibility to cultivate that, because that's where our maturity is. So I want to say is that I think there's a lot of ways of discussing this with different people. And I have to say that in my own life is the more I engage in that experiment, the more I'm willing to take those risks, the more I develop my own capacity to be communicating with more and more people on a spiritual level.
It's funny because I feel the same way. I still love having these conversations with my friends and my family. But largely that's also what's drawn us closer together, is because we know that the conversations that we're having, some people in this world are diving into more and more. And yet we know that there are some people very resistant to the exact things that we're talking about.
Oh, very much so. And my sense is that we have to place what we're doing within the larger context. And the larger context is the processes we're talking about are long-term processes. And they happen over generations. And they happen over not decades, but they happen over centuries. And so any real transformation is going to happen literally at a relatively slow pace from the bottom up. Like my attitude is, what I know about history is that there have been changes in power from the top down, but there's really the only fundamental changes that happen, that mature humanity always happen from the bottom up. And maybe Christianity might be the best documented example of that, where all the initial followers of Jesus were essentially the poor, the dispossessed, the downtrodden in society. This is where change really originates. And I think that's important. And I think that's important for me to keep in mind, or for you to keep in mind, because who are we in society? We don't have the possession of material power, that kind of thing. But it really is within us, shall we say. We're just part of the masses, the common people. And we're the ones in our relationships that ultimately are the ones who are going to have the most effect on future generations. It's a reason for us to act in society, as opposed to wait for people who are in control to do something. My sense is that's just not going to happen.
No, and the way you speak of your experiences in the Baha'i faith, I go to, and for 5 or 6 years now, I've been attending regular Bible study and sharing those ideas and experiences with you, and we see the commonalities in all of this. And I often had mentioned to my Bible study group members too that the messages I glean from Jesus' experiences are not one of separatism and exclusivity. Christianity isn't even a word that showed up associated with Christ until after. So Christ's teachings is the revelation of unity.
Oh, yes.
There isn't one thing I've studied about that guy that he's preaching exclusivity and division.
No.
Now, have Christians manipulated his teachings at times in history to twist the message? Clearly, the answer would be yes. So we can talk in another episode someday about all those, but we know that has happened. And when you study history, you know that religion and organized religion will often get corrupted by people that are in it for self and material gain or power. So sticking with the spiritual essence of what we are talking about, the purity of these revelations are common within all of the world faiths and can be found in there. And if people want to look, I think one of the scholarly exercises I want to try to engage in is pull the messaging from the world faiths of brilliance and beauty and show where there's commonality amongst them all.
Well, I do want you to know that really is what attracts me to the Baha'i faith, because the Baha'i faith has done that. Mm-hmm. This revelation which really is about the unification of all humanity worldwide within one, shall we say, spiritual civilization, is really, it's the one of the foundations for it to move forward is there to be unity between the world's religions.
You know, I just thought of something with you saying that, and it's maybe the impediment. Sometimes to get to that progressional or the progress phase of the manifestation of Baha'i as one, it means other people have to feel, or they feel they have to give something up to get. And I don't know if it's necessarily that. Can it be looked at as an add to? Now, Baha'i, we added to the collection of world faiths that all were trying at some phase in history to manifest a common reality.
Well, I mean, this is something that I think it definitely relates to the topic we're talking about, and it might also go beyond it. And so it might be something we want to pull out and talk in more detail about later. But the basic outlines of the Baha'i understanding of the relationship between the world's religions over time is basically this. It's the idea that all revelation is progressive. The idea that there is only one God, there is one creator, and therefore, over time, there really is only one religion. The Baha'is think of it as the faith of God. It's that idea. And to me, this is the only thing that makes sense. God would not be in the business of creating conflict and division and war between people.
Right.
This is something people do. This has nothing to do with God.
Right.
And so I think it's important. So the way I think of it is the progress of it is it's almost like the progress of humanity's education. So on an individual level, is you have an educator. So for instance, you're taught in first grade is when you reach as an individual first grade, there's certain things you need to know, like you need to know what the letters are, and you need to know what the numbers are, and maybe you can get to the point where you know a little bit about arithmetic, but in first grade, when you're a child, shall we say, is you might not have the cognitive capacity yet to do calculus. That doesn't mean your teacher doesn't know calculus. It's just like you meet people where they are. So for me, this is how I think of when humanity is in the childhood of civilization, is they're getting basic rules like, do not bear false witness and, do not covet the property of your neighbor, things like that. Those kinds of things, thou shalt not. Like these are basic rules of life. You don't do these things.
Right.
Those are how the commandments are worded. And that makes sense at that point in history. Right. But at some point, just like you progress, there's a point where humanity also collectively progresses. And so God, being a divine educator, is going to send someone for humanity at that point in time. So, for example, there's a point in time where you're capable of understanding that even though your parents make rules for you that restrict your freedom, that they're actually doing it for your own good. It's because they love you, okay? And that's the point in the progress of your own individual growth, where essentially, to me, Jesus makes sense. because Jesus is about the spirit behind the law, and that's God's love for us. And Jesus himself is the best example in history of what it actually means to love humanity, in so many fundamental ways, because that's so foundational for our development. But you have to have grown up enough before that's something which makes sense.
And that's the love that I have, and I know you have, of history as a discipline. It reveals a lot of these truths to us if we are tempered enough and diligent enough to admit, and this is the crazy thing I think about both you and I and other people, is the emotion. I don't know if it's I've actually talked about it in Bible study that I've turned it into an emotion of humility. Like, as much history as I know, I am still awestruck by all the things that I don't know.
Oh, for sure.
And I've only come to that discovery through knowledge and a faith pursuit. Like, all I know is that my pursuit will never end.
Oh, that's for sure. And I don't think the revelation will ever end either.
But our young people and even adults, even outside, I was just talking to my friend Jimmy. He said, I need to get that paper. I need to get that thing. I need to reach the end of my journey so I can do the next thing, which usually ends up being, in our culture, gaining material independency. So I need to check this off the box, meaning becoming educated, which is an insane way to look at it for guys like you and me. The essence of education is and or spiritual pursuit is a recognition of our own humility under God, and that will allow us to know him more.
Right. Well, I think that's true, and I think that's one of the things that excites me about moving into a civilization which is based upon a spiritual paradigm, because the moment that something is spiritual, it's process-oriented.
Isn't it almost a return to a spiritual paradigm?
I think in many ways it is,
Yeah.
right? I think we've lost touch with the necessity that civilization be based upon spiritual principles, and this is a regain. It's both a regaining touch with that idea, which has been lost, but it's also a moving forward based upon our present circumstances.
Because we're global and we are layering over culture,
right,
and intercommunicating between faiths and disciplines and histories.
Right.
For post-industrial revolution, the world is one from an economic standpoint.
From every standpoint.
Yeah.
From a biological standpoint.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? We're understanding how interconnected scientifically everybody is to each other, and how connected we are to everything else.
Yeah.
You know, it's that as we grow in our scientific knowledge, it literally supports the essential oneness of humanity and the relationships between humanity and the rest of creation.
Yep.
And how interconnected we are, and how you can't separate one from another.
Right.
And I think that this really is all of this knowledge is raising humanity's collective consciousness. That we are one, and that what we need to do is formulate and organize a society which reflects and promotes that spiritual reality, you know, that idea. But when you think about it, is the foundation for this is in many ways it's still the, shall we say, the Christian revelation is still an essential foundation for the building of that unity. Jesus may not have spoke about unity of humanity around the world expressly, because that would have been impossible in the situation he lived in.
Well, he did say, my people and God's people will come from all nations.
Right. They will. But we're at the point now where people are interconnected, because communication and transportation technologies today have allowed for us to see for ourselves in our experience of our lives the oneness of humanity. So now that the unity of humanity around the world is possible, And for that to happen that's something for which humanity requires spiritual guidance that builds upon the foundation that I think Jesus revealed to humanity.
Yeah, I think, yeah. And I think one of the things that, here's the thing anyway. Another
Here's the thing.
Yeah. But that the way that I would often try to get new classes and new students each year over the last few years of me maybe understanding this construct, just to get them to break the ice and think about the construct of spirit, would be throwing up a couple ideas like the idea or concept of the scientific discovery of DNA, right? Which means it's a code. So naturally, I would have kids get to this point, but ultimately you get to the point of, well, where did the code come from? Who wrote the code, or what wrote the code and created it? At the very least, I don't know the answer, and neither does anyone else that I would be asking the question to. And that would be a quick way to break the ice, and now we can explore spirit a little bit. And then the other one was, we just spoke of all these animal species. There's over 2 million species on Earth. One planet amongst gazillions in the cosmos.
Right.
And somehow we have adults and teens that look at you and say, that's not true. I know the truth. I mean, it's that crazy where we are and where we need to go to get to this point that did 2 million species really manifest shortly after the Big Bang? There's surfacey things on paper that just don't even seem like they would make any logical sense via the reasoning gift we've been given. So, and at the end of that short little intellectual journey, all I've gotten my students hopefully to do is realize that we don't have all the answers. And this should actually make you want to learn more. But at times, if I were to ask those questions, now it becomes, the institution may even think that you're trying to lead people to something. Well, what is it? What is a teacher at the end of the day? Are they trying to teach things to people that people don't know?
Well, I can only tell you what I've done. I mean, to me, is everything you're talking about is trying to teach truth within institutional systems of power.
Yes.
And so this is never going to work.
Right.
Because that it's just like banging your head against the wall until you pass out and bleed to death. To me, that's the process. And so I'm grateful for the work and the relationships I made while I was teaching, but I'm also relieved that I no longer have to be banging my head against that wall.
Right.
To me, the solution is for people who care about education, and certainly you and I both do, is to essentially leave that disintegrating institution and let the process kill itself, so to speak, while we focus more and more about formulating and creating what would be the genuine foundations for a system that would function in order to empower people to develop their underlying spiritual capacities, both of intellect and, shall we say, spiritual knowledge, in order that they could live lives where they could reach their full human potential. This is what is missing. And so my work now, and I think that our conversations are part of that work, is beginning to talk through how we could begin to lay those foundations for future generations to develop entirely new systems of, shall we say, mass education that essentially include the whole of reality as the curriculum, both the material reality and the spiritual reality as part of a, shall we say, an education that is healthy or whole for people as in future generations as they grow. And I feel like that's the stage of history we're in. We're in that stage of history where we have an opportunity to be part of the building of conceptual frameworks that in future generations will be put into practice. Imagine, and that's exciting.
Imagine the framework of academia if it actually began to perceive the interdisciplinary realities of do you think I would have been much more interested in math had somebody presented it to me that it is actually another language and part of the communicative organization of the universe? Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. So as we study the schooling or education ideas that we're talking about, as they emerge in this new paradigm, it's going to be one of showing the unity and connectivity of all of the disciplines that are traditionally looked at as separate entities.
Oh, for sure. It's a completely new paradigm.
It's going to be a new
totally
paradigm.
different way of thinking.
Yes.
Where we don't have like different academic disciplines that are, shall we say, so specialized. Mm-hmm. But we'll learn skills of analysis, but there'll be skills of analysis within context. So when we're, for instance, learning about the meaning of justice, which is a spiritual quality, we have a capacity for justice, which is a very strong motivating force on a spiritual level for individuals.
Don't traffic children again.
Is we need to know what is true and what is not.
Yes.
But what is true and what is not could be known through art. What is true and what is not could be expressed through literature. What is true and what is not could be the subject of a history class. What is true and what is not could be essentially something which is scientific or mathematics.
Yes.
And so all of these subjects are integrated into a curriculum that helps individuals cultivate their inherent power to discern what is true from what is false in every context of their life. And to me, this is absolutely fundamental for human progress, individually and collectively, and it's 100% missing in the way that our present institutional systems are organized.
Right. It's almost like God has this just unbelievable sense of humor where He's created these what have been obstacles for thousands of years of humanity coalescing and working together. And for the first time, maybe now, because of globalization, because of the advent of instant communication and immediate travel, and maybe they had that in the ancient past. I seem to believe that myself. But, we are emerging as a civilization that realizes its connectivity, but is in the process of removing the impediments of working together.
Yes.
Right. And that stripping away of those things that are getting in the way of us working together, ironically, are positions and systems of power. And usually the occupants of those positions of power do not have the best interest of humanity in mind.
No.
In fact, it might be just the exact opposite.
Oh, definitely.
And that's the scary stuff.
Right. It's very interesting. I mean, if there's one takeaway, like from all the conversations we've had, is that all of the conversations we've had are at its core about, shall we say, regaining a fuller sense of ourselves as spiritual beings, and having that guide us in the way we live our lives, in the way we act within society, even the way we organize society. But when we think about it, is we're just a couple of old guys, or guys you're not so old, but I'm a little bit older. And I want to say is that if you are watching or listening to this at this point, and you've listened to some of this, is one of the things which I hope stand out to you is the amount of energy that exists within our conversations. Because to me, is at the moment that you embrace the whole of reality and put spiritual reality in its place, which is primary, not secondary,
primary,
is the moment you release this incredible energy that's positive and creative. And this is available to everybody in their life. It doesn't matter how you were raised or what you were born into, or whether you're an atheist or a Buddhist or a Christian or a Muslim or a Baha'i. It doesn't matter. All that stuff is secondary. The point is you're a human being. And I want, and I hope that kind of energy is an attractive force for those who are listening or those who are watching, to see that it doesn't matter how old you are. That this itself is something which is positive. It's full of possibility. It ultimately is creative, and it gives our lives a lot of purpose and meaning, which otherwise I'm not sure it has in our society. So it's something to consider when you as a listener or a viewer are thinking about, is this the kind of thing that I want to investigate for myself?
Well, because let's use that language. You're not to be a viewer your whole life. You're to be an actor. And what I think what's bringing you and I greater fulfillment is that we are acting in this, and not actor like we're pretending. We are actually being the actors of and trying to participate and engage in the course and process of change instead of being an entertainment culture and a consumer of entertainment. And that's a big ask we are putting out there for individuals. People have to make that decision ultimately for themselves. Do you want to be a consumer of information, or do you want to use information in a productive capacity or to help, I guess, humanity and to engage in these conversations? So
Yeah.
yeah.
So
I think that's a pretty good one, my friend.
Yeah.
All right.
It's always good to talk.
Always good to talk to you, Bob. We'll do it again soon.
Okay. Until next time.
Bye.